Well, my brother started working in comics, and he was doing various companies, and then he heard of EC, and he liked it there, and he was doing, I guess, the bulk of his work there for a while. And they got dissatisfied with the coloring that was being provided by the company that printed the plates for the, as most comic book outfits had their plates printed at this company, Chemical Color in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And they would send the artwork up there, and they would send back what they called silver prints and for me to color. But before then, they would do the coloring on a lot of the early Crime Patrol and the Love books and the cowboy books that they did before I was around. And when Harvey came, he was very interested in having accuracy and more artsy coloring, and so was Al for his horror books. They were beginning to take off, and they wanted to have a good quality of everything, and they had good quality stories, they had good quality pencil inking, so forth, and design. And so my brother said, oh, you're unhappy. I bet my sister could do that stuff. She's coming along. So it wasn't really nepotism, because they would have fired me at the drop of a hat if I wasn't any good. But because my whole family was artistic, I could handle it. And I knew what they wanted, and I was starting out, so I was very interested in doing a good job. And then I got the whole line to color. Isn't that nice? No, it was the subject matter was fun to work with, really. And I learned a lot. And Harvey, the first story I did, I remember my brother came home, he says, Harvey liked your stuff. He says, you're the first person that didn't color the moon yellow. And I said, what moon? I don't even remember the moon in the story, but you know, the moon to me, and only on special times is there a yellow moon. But you use the color, you use the white of the paper, as awful as the paper was in those days, as a color, white. So that's what I did. But there was little things like that that I was a little more thoughtful in evaluating the depths of pictures, because I had a somewhat artistic training. And I did go to a cartoonist and illustrator school for a short time, but most of my schooling was from my father and my brother, of course. Okay. My mother could draw too, but it was mostly my dad with the painting and so forth. Oh, right. Well, when I first met him, good vibes. Good vibes. And of course, he didn't have the big beard or anything. He was just a guy, you know, a little heavy set. And they were very polite, you know, tie and shirt guys. You know, maybe them rolled up once in a while. But in those days, in the 50s, men dressed, and women, you went to work with heels on. That's why most of us turned out with bad feet if we continued working. But yeah, it was a regular business office. You could have been downtown or uptown or anything. It was just an office, and nobody looked slobby or anything. I'm not saying they look slobby today, but you know what I mean. Nobody came in short, ripped off dungarees, or it wasn't the style. The only one that was very, very casual was Williamson, because he was out playing ball with Frazetta and Torres and all his other friends, you know, and he'd come in, you know, they come in with the bat, you know, and come in, I'm going to do this, you know, and they were the kids, so.
Okay.
Yeah, and Bill was always cordial and very polite, and you just got the idea that he was the boss, but he didn't project like, don't fool around with me, you know. It wasn't like that. He wasn't officious. He was very easygoing, nice, and he told you what he wanted, you know. But there was a freedom there, as Al spoke of at the convention the other day, that Al gave a lot of freedom to his artists and stuff. And so did Harvey to a great extent, but Harvey would do layouts on the stories, so he had more, but he was more artsy-fartsy in his stuff, his art, and even his war stuff, he wanted exactly the way, accurate and everything, while Al's was more fantasy orientated, science fiction, and horror can be. You can have a wonderful, terrible, horrible murder in a mansion in the 1890s or right on 42nd Street. So, you know, you can do it any way you want. Not that you would change the story, but I'm saying he wouldn't tie you down to accuracy. Like it would have to be a 1953 New York City cab in the story. You know, you could fool around. Family, okay. Yeah, I suppose so. I felt very comfortable with them. I thought they were my friends, pals. I could ask them, I could ask questions of my boss. I could ask Feldstein and Harvey or Bill. I don't understand this, and you didn't feel like you were charging and interrupting anything, or that you were taking their time. They were really generous in explaining. I learned a lot, and I learned a work ethic. Not only was my family that way, orientated that way, they were a bit old-fashioned, but which was good, I think. But The Office was too. And Al Feldstein, he never wasted a minute. And yet you could stop and say, Al, how do I scale something down? I don't know how to do this. And he'd say, okay, Marie, you should know that already, you know. No, all right. And with Bill too, you could, I didn't know, or I'm sorry, or you know, something. But they were fun to be with. And Harvey too. Harvey was a delight. He was a delight when he would be talking about telling you a cartoon or a joke, or telling what he's going to do in a story. He would suddenly turn from this gnome-type figure, a little serious, into this elf. And he'd be dancing around. They were funny. It reminded me later on, Stan Lee would do that, and he wouldn't be cutesy humor stuff, but Stan would jump on top of desks and stuff to tell you a story. Later on, he didn't do that. He was too busy when the books really took off at Marvel. But Harvey was like that. He would act out these things, and he looked like his drawings. He looked like them, and you were just charmed by the whole thing. You couldn't help but like him, even if he was so autocratic with when he wanted the work done. You didn't mind, because you knew deep down he was just as nutty as you were, you know. So that was one aspect. Al was great to work with, too. I really enjoyed him. You know, they say I'm the censor, and that really, I would never blot out artwork, but I was afraid with some of them when they'd have someone, well, I don't know whether it would be a case of disembowelment, but it would be pretty disgusting if you colored the gunk coming out of somebody. And so I would color blue, or if somebody's head was, you know, the brains falling out, well, you know, you color it blue. And somebody said later it probably saved us from even more blasting because people didn't notice it as much. But the kids did. They knew what was under there. And I didn't color anything to obliterate, just to tone it down a little, that when Mom found the comic, she didn't see the eyeball hanging out or something, you know. And, you know, and it was tongue-in-cheek with the kids. It was the grim fairy tales, you know. And it was thrilling, because everybody was beginning to be a little stiff, you know, in those days, in the 50s. And EC was loose. So that was good. But anyway, Graham Mangles, for instance, would color a cover, and sometimes his watercolors were so too intricate or too detailed or too refined for the interpretation of the primitive coloring we had then. We didn't have computers. And they had to do this all on metal and moires up there, you know, and it took a long time, and we didn't have that much time. And they could only charge a certain amount of money, I suppose. It was a 10-cent book. And sometimes I'd have to recolor those. For the most part, all the insides, and for the most part, I would say at least 3/4 of all the covers from that period on. Maybe more, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. They all look good. Wally Wood would drive me absolutely crazy, but because from page to page he would color, like you'd have a bandolier or a button or a scarf on a guy, and the next page the scarf is gone, the bandolier is running this way, and the belt buckle is over here, there's a round on one page. But the end result, well, what I ended up doing, I'd read the whole story twice and make sure, this, and this, that's not there, So I wouldn't color them a glaring color the first time. I'd color them all brown, so that if he shifted where they were, because they didn't edit that much, they didn't care with it. Harvey did, but on the science fiction and on the historical and horror books, the guy could have the pattern on his tie or not, you know, if nobody bothered mixing it up. But the favorite, Woody was very satisfying because his inking was so sexy-like. He had shadows and glitzy and, you know, lovely-looking whoopie-doo ladies, you know. And you'd work a little harder on it, but it came out glitzy. Even in those primitive, what you had the tools to work with, it came out looking really glitzy. And the kids, I think he was one of the fan favorites. Davis was very easy to color, very much like the Jack Kirby that I colored many years later, because his blacks were so powerful. You could hardly ruin the story, but you could aid the mood of it by bringing things forward and back. But because the blacks were so strong, you had to be a moron to do it wrong. Woody was great. Davis was very easy. Severin was good, but naturally he was good. He's my brother. And, and I had to be accurate with him because all his stuff was accurate. But it was fun to color because it was like coloring I'm not as good as he is, but we are similar in our techniques. So I enjoyed that a lot. Graham Engels, really a riot because I'd be chuckling as I was doing the stuff. It was so hideous, you know. Very moody if you felt. What I liked about it was what the readers, I think, liked, that in a book you got 4 different artists in some cases, and it was all different moods, so you never got bored coloring. It was all the different stories, 6 pages of this, 6 pages of history. Orlando was good to color. Williamson, science fiction, and Kriegstein, he too. You wanted to do it science fiction-y, but I hadn't seen that much of it. But what we were striving for is what the Star Wars people got later on. That was what we knew, what we wanted to see in space, you know, and the imagination was there. Inking was very good on the science fiction artist, and Williamson was fun to color, but it was hard sometimes because he put so much work in it, and you didn't want to obliterate. One splash page he had on a jungle scene on a foreign planet, on a heavenly place. Trees and vines and blah, 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 and then, of course, the bingo, shiny spaceship. And this jungle scene was so gorgeous that I thought, if I put colors on this crappy paper that we have, and the printing is so primitive, if it's off register, I colored the whole thing in pale yellow so you could see all the inking work. And everybody thought, oh, you colored the whole splash in practically all yellow except the spaceship. I said, yeah, but you can see it, you see. And that's why they liked the thoughtfulness of it. The writers try to help the story, the artist did, and last little old me, I saw fortunately for me too, I saw the quality of what I was working with and tried to add to it by not overdoing anything, you know. Did I cover all the artists? I didn't mind any of them, but Woody was hard because I had to follow up what he was doing, you know. And Williamson, sometimes you had to be very careful not to obliterate anything because he had all this diddly-do going on. But they were all fun to color because of the variety, you know. I could color Davis the fastest for some reason. Oh, and Johnny Craig, his stuff. And now here's Mr. Neat, Mr. Clean. His stuff, it was so, and Kamen too, nice clean stuff that when it got horrible, that was fun too, because sometimes that was difficult because they draw it and almost looked like advertising art. You know, and the next guy come along would be Graham Engels, where everybody was wearing, you know, smelly wool and old 4,000-year-old satin, you know. Well, Mr. Fifth Avenue, Johnny Craig, you know, his stuff was neat and clean until he was chopping up his wife. So, the kids loved it. And I enjoyed Mad was a riot to do. Sometimes Mad was very difficult because if like Elder would put all these gobbledygook things, these little jokes and eyeballs popping in, or a jar of olives that was eyeballs or things like that. And if you colored everything, you'd be lost of the story continuity. And a lot of kids told me that they would read the story first and then go back and look at all the funny stuff, you know. So I colored that way too. I didn't want to highlight too much with all the details because it would distract from the story. Read the story and the punchline. And if you notice, the humor was written with great brevity, which is the best way to do it. You know, while the science fiction with the Ray Bradbury adaptations, Feldstein was locked into heavy text, like he said at the con yesterday. Some of the artists say the panel would be like this big, and you'd have the guy looking through the text. It was just 2 eyes looking at him.
Tomorrow.
I came back to comics after the comics code had sort of shook up the industry and people were wandering around bumping into doors. And I went back to Stan Lee just to pick up some freelance, and I was put on staff, which was fine. It was great. And I worked there a couple of months, and then when Ditko left Doctor Strange, I think Bill Everett did one or two. And then I took over. I think Everett did one. I'm not sure if I went directly from Ditko to it myself. I think I might be thinking of another thing. Hulk I was thinking of. Anyway, I filled in, and that was good. But if I might mention beforehand, they discovered, Stan knew I could draw, but he never really looked at my portfolio. He needed somebody desperately for the production. And one time they were having a thing on the colleges in Esquire magazine, and they were doing a, a feature in the book about how the college campuses are thinking in pop art and costumes and superheroes and the dope and the bing and the bong. And they wanted somebody to illustrate that. And they wanted, I think they asked for Jack Kirby, but I think Saul Brodsky, thought Kirby would be late on something, which would, Kirby was so fast. And he said, why don't you go over and see if they'll use you? And they did. I did 5 pages. And when Martin Goodman, who owns Marvel, saw it, he said, what is she doing paste ups? Put her on a book. Ditko leaves, I get the book, and all of a sudden I'm in the comics, which was fine, you know. But I never was chasing after this stuff because I just, I like the work. And I always entertain myself in my private life by drawing, you know. I enjoy doing cartoons with my friends more than I enjoy working. You know, I think most people are like that when you're doing your own stuff. So, but then from there, I did the Hulk. And I followed, I think, Everett or Buscema on that. That was hard because Buscema is absolutely fantastic, and he's anatomically so correct. He's the Michelangelo of the business. Anyway, and I did Submariner after Buscema left that. I think he was going on to The Surfer at that time, and then I did the Submariner for some issues. And so I got around, you know, but they're hard guys to follow because I was my inking looked like the caveman stone stuff, you know. But I was learning, and I enjoyed it. I had the spirit of it, and I think that's what saved me. I had the spirit of the superhero, and the action, and the moving of the bodies, and the guts.
Well, I had gone to New York from college to take 1 year at the Art Students League on the GI Bill. And I'd go to school at night, and I'd go around during the day and try to sell a strip, and comic strip, you know, wanted to be syndicated. And I walked around, and I couldn't find any work or anything. I went around to all of the big syndicates. And every one of them, you know, I'd send in there, and they'd look my work over. I'd have to come back maybe next week and pick it up or something. And every time I did, they didn't give you a pink slip. They just said, it's just, we don't need it, we don't like it, and that's it. So I tucked my tail and get out, man, and that was depressing. So I started looking around at the magazine racks and the comic books, and they had a lot of romance magazines, and I couldn't do romance. And then they had this horror bit, and I said, you know, that might do. So I went down to EC Comics in Lower Manhattan on Canal Street, and went in and showed them my work, and they said, this is horrible, we like it. So, so then from then on, they gave me a script, and I'd take that script home and pencil a drawing, and you know, and then bring it in, and they would okay it. And I'd pick up a check on the spot. And I keep saying that, telling everybody that you didn't have to bill them or anything. You brought the work in, and they'd pick up another script, and they'd write you out a check. And that's where I started working very, very fast. Well, it was a big family, and what was so great that, you know, you didn't have to actually go in there and work. You would take a script home with you. And when we were first married, we lived in a small apartment in Scarsdale, and I worked practically in the living room when we were first married, and then I went to a smaller room like a nursery, and you'd bring your work home, and you'd go back in maybe, and I, you know, started doing that about once a week. So it wasn't really like punching a clock or anything. You'd call them up and tell them I'm coming in, and they'd have a script ready, and they'd pay you, and so it was great. And then they'd come in and go to lunch with some of the other artists to bring in their work in. And that was great. That's the only way I got to know them. Bill Gaines was a big, abrupt kind of guy and in a way kind of shy. And in the beginning, I was frightened. I was afraid of him because he was the big man. And he was gruff, and he was always polite and nice, but he was a very giving person. He would give bonuses. Like I said, he'd give you a check when you come in, and he'd give parties, and he'd give Christmas parties, and of all things, that was so great that he took all of the mad artists on all of these trips that I have no way that I would have ever gone there to all of these places. And we've been to, you know, South America, Dutch Guiana, been to France and to Germany, Italy, Sicily, Northern Africa, Kenya, and all around in there. Been to Japan, been to Bangkok. We have been to Tahiti, and that was all gratis. I mean, you know, and we'd go for a week, and it would be just the men. But eventually, the wives would go along, and that kind of put a damper on things, and it wasn't as much fun. But Bill was a very generous person. Well, I was when you watch the news, and there stands Kefauver, and there still stands Bill Gaines, your publisher, and they are making fun of him and showing things maybe that I had drawn or somebody else had drawn that was bloody, or you know, somebody firing a pistol, and that all of a sudden hit home. And I don't like to, you know, really influence some kid to do bad things or whatever. And I might be a hypocrite, but I go to church, you know, every Sunday. I did go to church then, and I was a scoutmaster. I'd, you know, had Sunday school classes, so, you know, but I didn't really realize what, you know, I was doing. Again, as part of growing up, I was very young, and I was not wealthy, you know, and the money meant a lot, and EC was my income then. I mean, that was it, even though I didn't have a salary from them or anything like that, so I depended on that, and I just really didn't hit me, you know, and as you get older, you think a lot more, and you become a little more wiser and the whole bit, and I don't have to work for something like that anymore. And
okay, all right, good.
Just kind of distasteful. When all of this happened, every time, you know, an issue would come out, they'd give you about 10 issues to keep or whatever, and then when that happened, I went up and we had a fire in the winter that night, and they just sat there and I burned them. And now they're worth something, I guess. But they really weren't that bad, you know, they're not that horrible, I don't think, you know. Sometimes they do get a little gruesome, but. I'm sailing along, you know, cranking out all of the horror bit, you know, and some of it is kind of gruesome in the whole bit, and then I get a script, and I really didn't want to do it at the time, but because I was who I wasn't the boss, and everybody else is doing it, and so I did the script. I didn't write it, but I drew it, and I felt very bad about that, and of course, everybody really jumped on that because it was awful. But again, it was kind of funny, but nowadays it would be nothing. But in those days, I guess it was really something. And mothers and fathers say, I don't want my kid to read that. No way I'd believe it. I mean, coming to San Diego and seeing these thousands of people, that's just mind-boggling. I can't believe it. And just goes to show what you sit in your little apartment and you work and you draw and the whole bit, and meanwhile millions of people are reading it, and that's something. It's the same with the syndication today. People read the comic pages, and sometimes I don't think they realize how many people really read it. Wally Wood knocked me out, and he was influenced by Alex Raymond and Harold Foster. I mean, he could draw like them, and he was so good, and his color and his imagination and everything, it really impressed me. And then Graham Ingalls, who did The Witch and all that, his stuff, I didn't like it at the time, but as the more I went back and looked at it, the guy was an artist, and his paintings were unbelievable. You know, his oil paintings. He could have been a great illustrator. Well, along came a call from Time. They wanted me to do a cover. And it was on football. It was with Joe Namath. And so I did that cover, and I took it in, and they liked it. And first thing you knew, they called me back. But what they would do, Time, they'd call me up and say, this is going to be the cover story. I would go into Time, and they'd give me a pad with a red border and a black type of Time on it, just like the magazine itself, but a blank page. And I'd sit there with a 2B pencil by myself in a room and sketch up ideas going along with that. And a pencil sketch, and that's some of my best work that I've ever done, really. And then an editor would pick one that he liked and give that to me, and I'd go home and do that overnight or practically the next day and bring it in on a Thursday, and I think the deadlines were Thursdays. And then come Monday, I could go to the newsstand, and there's my cover on a Monday all over the United States and the world. Unbelievable, and that was a thrill. And they paid good money. And they've kept a lot of covers that's been in in Washington, the Smithsonian Institute, with covers and stuff. That's the thrill, and I get a big kick out of it.
I got started in comic books right out of high school, and I wasn't interested in going to college to take up a trade or anything like that as the family would like, and I always wanted to be an artist. And I'd heard going to art school. I went to the Art Students League in New York, and there were a number of young fellows a little older than I who were already doing comic book work in the way of doing inking, backgrounds, runners, all these menial jobs. And they gave me a few addresses, And so I made up what I thought was a sample of what I could do. And I went to one of the, what I think is one of the pioneer studios. It was called Harry Chesler. He was on 14th Street. Oh, no, yes, 14th Street in Manhattan. And I showed him the samples, and he hired me. Right off the bat, at the enormous salary of $15 a week. And that's how I got started. And I was doing backgrounds. Then, after about a year or two of that, being an upstart, pretty much, I decided that I wanted to do figure work and do my own stories. And so I made up another sample, and I showed it to the boss, and he said, well, you're not ready yet. But I fooled him. I went out to Fawcett Publications at that time, who had dropped a lot of their paperbacks and pulp magazines, and went up to one of the art editors over there and showed him my work. He was willing to give me a story, and I was 17, about 18 years old at the time. And I went back to Harry, and I said, I'll be with you another week, and then I'm going to leave. He says, oh, no, you're not. I'll give you a feature. I'll let you do what you want. So knowing the place, I stayed with Harry Chesler. And then it was continually up. And then another studio offered me a higher price, so I went with him. That was Jerry Iger at the time. His partner at the time was Will Eisner. And Eisner had left to start his own shop. Jerry Arger needed artists, and so he was very glad to hire me. And I stayed with them up until induction time, when I went into the service for 4 years. When I came out, I went back to the Arger Studios, and his main account there was Fiction House. And there I did covers, and I did a character, I forget what his name was, but the story was Ghost Gallery. Murdoch, that was the main character's name for continuity. And I did those. And then, of course, well, I'm cutting this very short, the romance era came in, and being noted as a good girl artist, I had a lot of work because I could draw, you know, pretty women, things like that. And then I decided I was going to go straight freelance. And so I began to go to all the different publishers, and I was getting work from a bunch of them. And finally, I landed up with Bill Gaines through my friend Al Feldstein, who was, well, as you know, later became the editor of Mad Magazine with the Gaines Enterprises. And he took me in because they had switched from all the little types of funny cartoon books that they were doing to romance. When they switched to horror and crime, I naturally went along with that. And for a couple of years, we did the horror and crime stories. Basically, the plot was always, as Bill used to say, Jack Kamen would draw a nice family scene, and the father would always be very nice, and the story would wind up where the wife kills him. So I mean, this is that's the type of thing I did. At the time, for a young man, it was good pay. You have to remember that I started out at a time when $55 was a good salary. I mean, men were supporting families on it, and I got up to $90 a week. So I thought comics were going to be my thing. A wonderful, wonderful man. Wonderful man. Very, very solicitous of all his artists. I like to think that we did develop a friendship. It was a triad friendship. Al Feldstein, Bill Gaines, and myself. Our families. In fact, as a side issue, Bill and his wife particularly was interested in the Pennsylvania Dutch area for antiquing and what do they call those knitted
Quilts.
the bed things.
The quilt.
Quilts?
The hand.
Quilting?
Yeah, the quilting.
Quilting. And so we used to combine. We used to take little trips out there and things, but it was purely social. So there was an intimacy that we did have with Bill. Al Feldstein and I, our families developed a deep friendship, and what he used to do in progress, he would bring a script home to his home, and I'd come down and see him. We were maybe 2-3 miles apart down the road. We'd discuss that, then I would do the pencils. I'd bring it back. When I were done with those, by that time he'd have another script for me. He would take the pencils to the office next morning, have them lettered while I was penciling another story. So I very rarely had to go into New York. In fact, I only knew the other artists as, I heard about them pretty much. Not, I wasn't in with the crowd. And I say that was our relationship for many years. It saved me time, And it was nice and comfortable. I didn't have to ride the railroad because we lived in Rockville Center. It was close to a half hour into the city. I mean, it was perfect. So that's about all I can tell you about. I mean, and knowing Bill socially, whatever, there would be an occasional dinner party, and we socialized that way. I think it was a joint effort between Bill and Al. I don't know how much Bill and I don't know how much Al, but they always had a great time when I came in, you know, being jolly and everything. They said, oh, we'd love to get this guy to do some torture stuff, you know. And so Al said, look, she says, I think I can write a story about this thing. She says, we'll call it Kamen's Calamity. And Al wrote the story. That's how that came to be. And they had a great time with it, particularly when they had as the men were coming into the office, they would add they had the page. I finished the story, and they had the page, and it was scheduled, so every time they delivered, they could do that one panel. You know, so Johnny Craig would do one, and Jack Davis would do one, Graham Ingalls would do one, and then it went off to the printer. I was always interested in the figure. I took many years of anatomy, so I was used to drawing different styles of people and the ideal form of women. And I always wanted to be an illustrator. And way back in the 1940s, I mean, every popular illustrator in the Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, the Cosmopolitan, were all had to draw. You had to know how to draw beautiful women, and that was my aim, to be one of those fellows. And so I just worked at it, you know, and just did it. In fact, it's an odd question you asked. I taught for a number of years in New Hampshire at the Art Institute, and I taught a class in illustration and figure painting, and they asked me the same question, how come you draw such good-looking women? And I said, well, I worked at it. That was always a problem for any of us, particularly if the story had a high literary content. But we had we had lots of ways of solving that. We'd do a page breakdown, and the artist would look at the script and anticipate a heavy balloon area, you know, type area. And so what he would do is some of the other panels, if they could be minimized in some way. For example, if it was an action of, typical example would be a city scene, say a woman getting into a taxi cab, and the associated panel having a lot of copy. Well, what he could do, or what I used to do, and it seems some of the others adopted that method too, you'd see a close-up of a woman, you know, getting into the cab, just half a body. So that would give you the rest of the panel for type. And you see a piece of the cab driver through it would be an angle shot. And you see the cab driver's head, so you knew right away, or put some stripes on the door, checkered cab, you know. So you knew she was getting into a taxi cab. Those were little doohickeys that you could get away with to minimize the top-heavy stuff. I did send in one time. It was very funny with I think it was a cop. I think it was a cop story of some kind. And I actually drew the cop. You only knew the cop is because he was wearing a cap with a badge, and I had his nose on the bottom line. Didn't even see his mouth, you know. And the copy was above. Actually, coming back to the fact that the stories were written for me, you know, to suit my format, I enjoyed all of them. Because, you know, as I say, they were tailored to, Bill and Al would get together and tailor a particular story, and they would tailor it for my abilities. And invariably, it was always it would have a domestic flavor. I'm trying to remember the movie that they modeled it on all the time, where the waitress wants to kill her husband who owns the diner.
Postman always rings twice?
Right,
Okay.
that one. Stories like that. That's what they'd write for me, you know. And immediately, that type of movie, whatever, which became popular at the time, would jump into my mind, and this is exactly what I would illustrate. So it was very handy. I mean, particularly when the stories are written for you. I think all of us felt that way, because when it came to the particular scripts going to particular artists, they were all written for what they would do. Engels got all the gloomy stuff to do. Bernie Krigstein got things where he could animate figure. He had a great way of taking a panel and then have a single figure and have it just like a set of stop action, which was his favorite way of doing it. Johnny Craig wrote his own. I remember Bill, he called me in, and this is when he was contemplating, I don't know whether he told this to the other boys or not, he says, and it's true, he said he had 3 months of the amount of money to pay everybody. He says, and I don't think past that, he says, I don't think I'll be able to carry the company anymore. So he suggested that I go look for other work. And paid us regularly. You know, we did the stories. They never saw the light of day or even a printing press. And that's when I took off. If he said this to anybody else, I don't know, but to me he did. He says, Jack, he says, I can pay you for 3 months. He says, but then after that, he says, all the money's gone. Absolutely tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. Very, very generous. I mean, we have these, you probably heard about them too, about the Christmas parties in July. He found out what our hobbies were, what other things we did. And one of the last gifts I got one of these Christmas parties was I already had these new babies of mine that arrived, the twins. And there was a camera, film, a screen, everything go to make home movies, you know. That was my July Christmas present. An unbelievable man, unbelievable boss, very, very, very sympathetic, you know. Either he liked you or he didn't know you, you know, that was it. And everybody loved him. Everybody loved him. Never. Never. Never at all. Never at all. It's hard to believe because it wasn't a, first of all, the enormity of the idea is to me, is tremendous. And about the only things that I ever thought would be celebrated again in an anniversarial manner would be Superman or Batman or these characters that have just been yearly issues, you know, still running today, you know. Our stuff is gone. Once we closed down the horror and the crime, it was only Mad. And Mad's still a fairly successful publication today. My second son, who's has kind of a fame in his own right. He is a very important man in the United States. Has a running deal going pretty much with Sotheby's. Sotheby's keeps getting these originals come floating in from everywhere, and he's buying them. He has the largest collection of original art of mine anywhere. I mean, as soon as it surfaces somewhere, he has somebody buy it. And the prices, of course, are as cataloged, coming in. It shocks the hell out of me. I wish I got that kind of money when I was doing him, of what he's buying him for. But he's a serious collector. He doesn't come to any of the conventions, and he has this. He had an arrangement with Russ Cochran, and he has arrangements with Sotheby's, where they go on auction. And when anything of mine comes in, you know, they'll call them up, say, Dean, we got a story of your father's over here somewhere. What? We don't know what we're going to classify it as, but, you know, such and such is the price. You know, they don't give him any preference in it. They publish the thing, they publish the catalog, and then the Dean waits for the highest bid, and then goes one over and picks it up. Thank God he can afford it.
So tell me what this is, Jack.
All right, this is the original art that was used for the comic book and also an enlarged version of the movie poster. The interesting story of that is that when Stephen King saw the pencil drawing and the finished drawing of this, he was absolutely astounded because the little boy in the cover resembled his own son. And Stephen, I think, has a little of the mysterious, superstitious, inventive mind, as you must say, and he was just carried away. They handled all the original Kamen art goes through Sotheby's, and Mr. Wiest normally will notify Dean, who's a primary collector, and he'll say, Dean, we have something or so-and-so from your father's artwork. Would you want to take a look at it or bid on it? It's available. Here's my example, by the way, of my teaching methods. If you notice the drapery, I say, what's the good of knowing anatomy if you don't know what the figure is doing underneath? See all the wrinkles? That's why they call me Wrinkles Kamen. You might as well see the real body under there.
Okay.
There was a time when the comic books, or the horror comic books, were doing very well, and Mr. Gaines thought, since I was one of his favorite artists, that I ought to get into the horror genre, but I wasn't doing very many. And as you see the story progresses, the premier artists of at the time that were doing the horror for Bill Gaines did their own individual panels, as you will see throughout the story. And Bill said, Jack, I know you could do this. I know you could do this, and if we have to, we'll write a special story for you so you can do a horror story. And he suggested the general outlines of this plot to Al Feldstein, who I believe wrote this story, to incorporate myself and certain biographical facts, plus the additions of Graham Ingalls and who else is in there?
Jack Davis and
Jack Davis and there's one other.
Johnny Craig.
Johnny Craig, who all supplied individual panels for yours truly.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions about some of this stuff now.
That would be easier.
Okay, it seems like you're always smoking a pipe.
I was an ardent pipe smoker.
Okay.
I was. I always walked with a pipe, always smoked with a pipe. And then for some reason whatsoever, I was told to stop smoking pipes, like getting cancer of the lips or just cancer in general from tobacco. So I stopped, but I was an ardent pipe smoker.
Okay, all right, good. Now, tell me about this. Bill Gaines is chasing, is that supposed to be, is that Nancy Siegel?
No.
Who is that? Why is he always chasing women here?
No, we made that story up about Bill. That was just part of the Bill Gaines legend, but was not true. We thought he should be.
Okay, all right, that's good. Let's see. Now, of course, they're playing on the whole thing that you were great at drawing women.
Yes.
And hired originally for the romance books.
Exactly. That's why we have that thing, and that's why we also had Bill chasing women.
Now, were you sad to see the EC romance books go out of business and for it to turn to horror?
Quite frankly, I didn't care as long as I had my 4 children to support. As long as we had work to do and get paid well and often. This is all I required at the time. And if that was a source for additional income, I loved every minute of it.
Now, of course, here are the panels where
Graham and Johnny Craig and Jack Davis.
now, whose idea was it to have them draw themselves? Was that your idea or Al's idea or Bill's idea?
I think it was, I would say it was either Al's or Bill's. I think maybe Al's idea, because he came up with these pretty rich ideas, and he wrote a lot of this stuff. So I would say if it was a collection of both, I would say it would be predominantly would be Al Feldstein.
Okay. Now tell me a little bit about the biographically, what's going on here, and are those the caricatures of your wife and kids?
Right, they are.
Okay. Who's who?
This one is Barton, who is now a very famous physician and specializes in cancer. This is professor, and that's Dean.
Okay. Whose house we are in right now?
Right, we're in Dean's house now.
Okay. Is this one of your favorite stories?
It would be one of them. I didn't have any really favorite stories. What I can say was that doing the work was very, very enjoyable, because Bill and Al, knowing that I didn't do the gory type of horror or of that nature, these stories were specially written, I would say, I think with additional effort for me. I mean, no other artist would do these. And they knew that I could publicly take a joke.
Okay, good. Look, one thing I forgot to ask you is, now in the story, you're constantly telling jokes, or
Yes,
wanting to tell
yes,
jokes.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm getting at.
Was that the Jack Kamen? Were you a big jokester?
That's me. That's me. That's why the inside story of this is to all the people that knew or in the industry. It's a favorite of everybody's for that reason, anyway. Because as bad as these stories could be, I always thought they were funny.
My first job professionally was for Famous Funnies, which was the first comic book ever printed, but there was reprints on newspaper strips. And it was for a very nice gentleman named Stephen Douglas, who was the editor. And I did, in those days, most comic books had to have a 2-page, just a regular story, not drawn. What do you call it? A text. Thank you very much. And it would have an illustration on one page on the top with the title of the story. And you turn the page, the end of the story, and the bottom would be another little illustration. And the first one was called The World's Ugliest Horse, and that's the first job I ever did. It was just 2 little illustrations. I got $10 for it.
Okay. All right,
that was
good.
in 47, I think. 47 or 48. 1947, 48, yeah.
Okay.
So Steve Douglas was the fellow that got me started in business. Nice man. Well, when I was a kid, I discovered I lived in Bogota, Colombia, in South America. And I discovered, well, I had these pair of skates, see. I was about 9 years old. We were living in a pension, and I was down in the courtyard. And this kid comes up. I knew the kid, and he had a bunch of Mexican comics. He says, "Hey, Al, I'll trade you these comics for the skates." I figured, okay. So he figured he had a great deal because he gave me these comics. He got the skates, you know. So he was ahead of the game. Well, I had never seen comics, and these were from Mexico, from a magazine called Paquin, and they reprinted American comics down there, plus from Europe as well, into Spanish. They were translated. And I was just fascinated with them, so I started collecting the magazine on my own. My mom used to get them for me. And then a few months after that, I was so excited about comics that I started drawing my own. And that was 1940. So I was 9 years old when I started drawing. And before that I drew too, but I drew cars and little buildings and all that, but I wasn't into drawing, if you know what I mean. It was the comics that got me. It was it was an Argentine artist that inspired me first. His name was Carlos Kamen, and he did a strip called The Undersea Empire. And it just grabbed me. And then around 1941, about a week or two before Pearl Harbor, my mom's reading the paper, and I'm on the floor in the living room, and I'm drawing, and she says, "Oh, they're showing a movie tonight that you might like. It has to do with rocket ships and things like that." So I was all excited about that. And but I didn't believe her. I didn't think, they don't make movies like that. They don't make rocket ship movies and stuff like that. So anyway, we came along. She took me to the movies that evening. We went there around 6:30 or thereabouts. And I sit down, you know, and the coming attractions come on, and the news of the day comes on. And finally, the movie, and I didn't believe it. I could not believe it. The movie and the title comes on. Flash Gordon conquers the universe. Oh, I couldn't believe it. It was like when you saw Star Wars. And I just fell in love with the film. I fell in love with the character. And I knew that there was a strip called Flash Gordon. And so I dug up the pages, and I got so excited. And the reason I got into it, because Flash Gordon was a real person to me. He was Buster Crabbe, you know. And so I started copying Alex Raymond's work. And you couldn't find a better artist, except maybe Harold Foster. Definitely Harold Foster, who did Prince Valiant. And I started copying the drawings of the Flash Gordon figures and all the figures he drew. And he was one of the best figure men in the business. So I learned how to draw figures by copying him. And that's how I got into comics. You know, I decided that's what I want to be, a comic artist. So that's it.
See.
Wally Wood was working with games, with EC. And we were friends. He and Joe Orlando worked together, and then Joe went on his own and worked for EC, and Wally did his own work for EC. And they kept telling me to go up to see Bill, you know, but I didn't think I was good enough. Then one day I sat down and did a sample, and I went up and I saw Bill and Al, and they liked it. They liked it, and they gave me a choice of two jobs. They had a science fiction one, and they had a horror story. And the horror story was kind of nice because it took place in the swamp. And I figured, well, you know, get something that's not going to be too difficult to do, you know. So I took the 6-page swamp story, and the thing that got me is Bill said to me, "Now look, Al, the one thing I ask from my artists is meet the deadline. You don't meet the deadline, you don't work for me." That scared the hell out of me. So I always met the deadline. So I did it, and they liked it, and they still had the other job, and I thought, well, maybe I will take it after all. So I did that too, and I had some help with that one. My friend Roy Krenkel and Frank Rosetta helped me with that. They did some of the inking and some of the backgrounds on that, so that was kind of nice.
Okay.
It was fun working with my friends. He was a good man. I had no problem with Bill. Like I think I mentioned it before, he said, the only thing I ask of you, Al, is meet the deadline. And of course, every time I came in with the job was on the day it was due, and he would go into, oh, he made it, Marie, oh God, oh, give me my pills. You know, he always went into a routine, you know, it was a riot. And no, it was a lot of fun working for Bill. And, you know, the guys there were just great. You know, I got to meet Harvey Kurtzman, I got to meet Johnny Craig, you know, and they were wonderful guys, terrific talents. You know, and of course I had known Wally. I mean, he's the one that pushed me to go up there. He and Joe Orlando pushed me to go up to Marvel, God, to EC, and it was nice. It was nice working with Bill. He was a good man. Well, I worked with two of the best guys. Well, I worked with quite a few guys that were very, very good. I started with EC, the first job I did myself. The second job, my dear friend Roy Krenkel helped me out with. He did some beautiful city backgrounds in it. And Frank Frazetta inked some things for me in that, which was nice. And on and off, I had Frank and Roy help me with jobs. And then later on, Angelo Torres helped me with stuff. We did work together. So I wasn't really very, what's the word, regimented. You know, I was just 21, 22 when I started. And it took me a long time to kind of grow up. It wasn't until I got married and when I was 29, 30 that reality hit me and said, okay, Williamson, sit down and get to work. No more fooling around. So it was a lot of fun. You know, I mean, I took my work seriously, but not as seriously as I should have. So consequently, most of the jobs done for EC, I had someone help me with it, work with me, you know, like Roy or Angelo Torres or Frank. They always came through. It was nice. Well, I enjoyed, you know, when you do a drawing and it comes out kind of nice, and then Frank inks it and it really looks good. It's kind of nice. You see, it wasn't a case of he's going to make me look better. It was a case, this is going to look better. You know what I'm saying? And Frank was a genius. He made that stuff look so good, and we liked looking at good art. You know, I mean, we were fans of Frank and of one another. So when Roy would do a background and I would do the figure and Frank would ink the figure and you know, I mean, it was great because it was a great thing to see. Three guys doing a panel or a page, and we enjoyed each other's work. So it was kind of nice to see it that way. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but it was fun. It wasn't a case of you know, oh, I pencil this and Frank inked it, but everybody thinks I inked it. No, no, no. It's a case that we all did it together. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Did you know at the time when you were doing this that you were creating these masterpieces?
Well, I don't know if they're masterpieces, but they were a lot of fun. Yeah, I think what Roy did was beautiful. And, of course, Frank's inking is superb. And some things I did were okay. You know, I like drawing figures, you know, so... I mean, I'm not the greatest, but what the hell, I did the best I could, and I think the three of us turned out nice-looking work. Yeah, there was more of a friendship thing, more of a family feeling. The Bill would get together and have get-togethers with everybody, at least once a year. You always had a Christmas party or something like that, you know. And we'd get together and we'd get to meet the families and all that, which was, I thought, very, very nice. You know, and I don't think anybody in comics was doing that, to my knowledge. So in that respect, it was a lot of fun working with Bill. So when the thing, you know, finished after the, you know, the Kefauver thing or whoever it was that screwed everything up, and as you know, comics were very bad for causing juvenile delinquency. And so as soon as they banned them, you notice juvenile delinquency is, you know, no longer with us. And anyway, don't mind me, I'm just being bitter. So what was the question?
Was the difference working for EC and other companies?
Oh yeah, it was a family thing. You know, we really got and everybody there admired everybody else, the artists, and the wives were very nice. I mean, it was really, there wasn't anybody you could say, oh, he's a pain in the neck, you know. I mean, they were all nice. They were all very, very nice people. So it was really a very pleasant 4 years for me. Very, very pleasant. 3 or 4 years, whatever, however, you know, very, very nice. Well, I have 3 favorites, and that's Harvey Kurtzman, Wally Wood, and Johnny Craig. They're my favorites, but this is not putting the other guys down in any way at all. Their work says something to me. I feel something from their work. And the other guys are very, very good too. Excellent. But those are my 3 favorites. If I had to, you know, my life depended on me, I'd have to tell you that, you know, who my favorites were. Now you know.
Okay.
All right? I didn't care to do civilian. I wanted to do either Western or science fiction or adventure. Drawing ties and shoes and cars and buildings was something I did not want to do. No way did I want to do it. And I just couldn't think horror. I wasn't into horror. I didn't care for horror movies. I mean, I'd see them, but I didn't care for that kind of stuff. You know, I'd enjoy them, but I didn't want to draw them. You know, I wanted to draw Flash Gordon. I wanted to, you know, draw adventure. So that's why I didn't do that much. I think I only did 2 or 3 horror stories. That's it, if that. I guess when you look back at what they did, what Bill Gaines and Harvey Kurtzman did was really good stuff. You know, especially what Harvey did. I think his books are just incredible. The war books were wonderful. They didn't sell as well, but they were wonderful. I mean, and the horror books weren't bad either. You know, Al Feldstein did a good job of writing that stuff. And they were entertaining. You know, I think you have to have a bit of a sense of humor to write that horror stuff. You can't really do it, you know. I think they always had a little sense of humor in their stories, and I think that's what the reader got. But you know, what do you got to do? You know, the powers that be say they're bad for children, causing all that juvenile delinquency. It's kind of a pity, really. My favorite story was the last one I did. Oh my gosh, what's the title of it? I forget the title, but my friend Roy and I worked on it together, Roy Krenkel. And he did the splash page. And there's a little food for thought, thank you. There's a little insert panel. I did that one myself. And he did the whole splash. I did the lettering, food for thought. And he brings it in. He took it at home and he worked. He brought it in a couple of days later. He says, Williamson, I've done the splash, but it needs your touch. And I said, what is it, Roy? He says, needs a flying snake here. Only you're the only man who can draw a flying snake. I said, Roy, you can do it. He says, no. You have to do it. I sat down, and I drew the flying snake with the little wings, and I spotted the snake. Finished it up. Just, Roy looks at it, says, there, that makes the picture. It's perfect. That's what it needed, your touch, you know. And he did all the work. All I did was a little flying snake, and he's raving about the flying snake. And this is this beautiful splash that he did with beautiful trees and foliage, you know, and it's, absolutely gorgeous. And he's raving about the flying snake. Dear old Roy, what a sweetheart. Anyway, he worked on that story with me. He did some of the backgrounds on that, and I did the rest. The figures, you know. In fact, I think I used Stuart Granger in that one. Yeah, I used Stuart Granger, or as close as possible. Because he was kind of, you know, always kind of like Stuart Granger. Yes.
Okay.
Good hero type.
Now that was also the story that you did the layout for.
Yes. I asked Bill if he would mind if I laid it out. And he said, no, just make sure that it reads, you know, boom, boom, there's no crazy layouts. I said, no problem, don't worry about it. So I did it as clearly, but I had a chance to use a long panel, you know, which they never did, and stuff like that. Do a little different, you know, a panel that I thought maybe this should be a little bigger because there are figures walking or something. You know, I had a chance to arrange it a little better, you know, to fit what I wanted to do, and not to be locked into certain panels, you know, without having my own choice of maybe making this panel bigger or smaller. So it was kind of, he liked it. He had no problem with it. He said, "Oh, you did a nice job, Al. Thank you." So that was very nice. But I have made every deadline that for all the editors and all the companies I worked for, I've made the deadline. And I've been in business for 50-some years. So I'm proud of that I was able to get the work done and meet the deadlines. So that's kind of nice. You know, I found out that if, like for instance, when I was doing X9, the job had to be in no later than Monday, 3 weeks prior to printing, publication of the strip. It had to be Monday, because if it came in on Tuesday, it charged you $150. Another $150 the next day, you know. So I couldn't afford it. I was only making $225. So anyway, I made the deadline every time. I'd drive it in even if it was a 2-hour drive from where we lived, I'd drive it in on Monday. And one week, I guess I've been doing it now for 8 years or so, the strip. I was exhausted that morning, and I had to, you know, I called up and I said, "Listen, guys, I ain't gonna I'll bring it in if you need it, if you really want this thing, you know, but I'm exhausted and I gotta get started in the next week." They said, "Al, you always meet the deadline. Don't worry about it. Mail it out. We'll get it tomorrow. No problem." That was nice. But then I always made the deadline. I wanted to do a newspaper strip, and I got to do that. I got to do Secret Agent X9, which was fun, and then I got to do Star Wars daily and Sunday, and that was a lot of fun. So no, I got to do what I wanted to do, you know, which was a newspaper strip, which is fine. I did that for X9 for about 12 years, and I did the Star Wars for 3.5, you know. So that was a lot of fun, and I had the best writer in the business, R.J. Goodwin. Best writer in the business. I did a story, I forget what it was called, but it was about these aliens who see a planet explode. Maybe that's the name of it, Aliens, but I'm not sure. And they're able to land on part of the planet that exploded. And they find a comic book. And these are fat little aliens, you know. And it's almost Bigfoot the way I did it, you know. And they read the story, and it's them. You know, my God, and look, and the last page is them looking at them, 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 looking at them. It's just, you know. And I had a lot of fun doing that story. And I brought that in, and Bill loved it. And Harvey picked it up, and he took it into his studio, closed the door. And Marie Severin comes out a little later and says, "I think Harvey's going to give you a script." And I knew then that no way I was going to work with Harvey, because I just couldn't think Harvey's way. And he came out and gave the 6 pages back to Bill and didn't say a word. He didn't ask me to do any work for him, but he kept it for about half an hour looking at it, which I thought was very nice. I felt good about that, that I couldn't work with Harvey. I knew I couldn't, not because I didn't like him. I liked him personally, and I respected his talent. I think he was a tremendous talent. I think he's one of the most talented guys in comics ever. So, but that was very nice, that he looked at it the way he did.
So why did you think that you
I don't think that way. I don't think the way he wrote the war stories. I just don't think that way. I wasn't into getting research and stuff like that. I just wasn't into doing that. I stayed away from also civilian work, people wearing ties and things like that, drawing, cars and cities and present-day stuff. I didn't want to do any of that. I just wanted to do science fiction or Western, so I didn't have to think. Just sit down and draw figures and horses and people punching somebody, and having that kind of thing, gunfights and all that fun stuff, figure stuff. I like to do figure stuff. I didn't want to just sit down and draw tanks and planes and guys with, headgear and all that stuff, realistic. That wasn't my thing at all. So
Okay.
I was lazy. And I didn't want to work with Harvey only because I knew that he demanded a certain amount of, he was a little too tough to work for. And I mean that in a good way, not in a negative way. And I have a lot of respect for Harvey. He was a real sweet man, very good person, terrific talent, just wonderful, just wonderful.
I first discovered EC Comics when I was about 13 years old, 14 years old, something like that. I had just about finished with my comics phase. I've been reading comics since I was 4 years old, because in a small town in Missouri in the 40s, that's about all there is to do if you want to read or some escapist type things. You go to the movies once or twice a week, and in between you read comic books. And I had basically had my fill of Superman and Captain Marvel and all the other comic books. So when I saw my first EC, I recognized immediately that these are different. They have twist endings, they have great artwork. The level of the writing was, I could, at that age, recognize that the level of the writing was higher than the writing in a lot of the other comics. They used more words, and they used them better. And of course, this is a tribute to Al Feldstein. I read all the ECs that I read in the 50s when they came out, and it just happened that I graduated from high school in 1955, which was basically the year EC died. And so I put all my EC comics into a box, made a padlock for the box, and put it up in my mother's attic, and went away to college. Then I didn't think much about EC or the comics until maybe 8 or 9 years later, when I had gotten my PhD. And when I got my PhD, which was in physics, I took a position as a professor at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. And as a part of my teaching there, they wanted me to go to a professional meeting once or twice a year. So the most important meeting, as far as I was concerned, was there's an annual meeting of physics teachers in New York City, and the AAPT, which is the American Association of Physics Teachers. And I thought that would be a good one for me to attend. So sort of as an afterthought, I was getting ready to go to one of these, and I wrote Bill Gaines a letter, which basically said, I would just like for you to know that of all the fellows who were in our EC club in West Plains, Missouri, one of us is a doctor, one is a lawyer, I am a professor, and there's not an axe murderer in the bunch, And knowing that he'd been given a rough time by the Senate committee and by the public at large for publishing the kind of comics that he published. And he got a big kick out of the letter. And he wrote me back, and he said, if you're ever in New York, come and see me. And so the next time I went to New York for a physics meeting, I went up to MAD and met Bill, and we had an immediate rapport. He loved to eat, and we would go out to eat at some of the nicest restaurants in Manhattan. And it got to be a sort of a pattern, like same time next year, that play or that movie. Once a year, I'd go to the physics meeting, and as time went on, I spent less time at the physics meetings and more time just hanging out with Bill and going out to eat with him and asking him questions about, you know, where's Graham Ingalls today, and why did you do this, and why did you do that? And he loved to talk about that. I think the EC period, 1950 to 55, were some of the happiest years in his life. They were certainly some of his most creative years. And so he enjoyed talking about that. When I was on one of my New York trips, Bill and I were eating dinner and talking about the old EC days, as we did most of the time. And I said, Bill, those EC comics were so great. You just don't know how many guys out there like me really love them and considered them very, very special. Why don't you publish them again? Why don't you try again to republish them? And he laughed real big and said, no. He says, I've got all I can do with Mad, and Mad is very successful. I want to keep it that way. And then he paused for a beat and said, why don't you do it? And didn't really sink into me until I was on the airplane going back to Des Moines, and I was kind of reviewing my visit, and I recalled that, and I thought, well, you know, why don't I do it? I was a professor at the time. I had tenure at the university. I was chairman of the department. My life was mapped out for me. I was going to continue to teach and become a doddering old professor and maybe a dean someday, and pushing papers around on a desk. And so without a thought of it maybe becoming my profession, I decided, okay, I'm going to do something. Well, about the same time, Bill had pulled artwork out of his vault for use in the Woody Gelman book, the horror comics of the 50s. And the first time I saw EC artwork, I was sort of amazed because, first of all, it's big. It's 13 inches wide and 18 inches tall, and it's like twice as big as a comic book, or 4 times the area, but twice as big in linear dimensions. And I immediately noticed when I would pick up a page of artwork and look at it that there was details in the artwork, little tiny pen strokes or brush strokes that the artists must have known when they did them that they weren't going to pick up in the comic books, because the comic books are cheaply printed on cheap paper. And I wondered, why are they putting this extra work into it when they know it's not going to show? So I had the idea that if I was enjoying looking at this art so much, there had to be a few thousand other guys out there who would enjoy it too. So I asked Bill if I could print a large portfolio. Originally, I was going to do it the same size as the original art, but that turned out to be a little impractical, so I scaled it down from 18 inches to 16 inches. It was almost as large, and I printed it in black and white, 1, because it was cheaper, and 2, because without the color on top of the line work, it was easier to see what the artist had done. And he said, sure. And so he drew up a little contract where I paid him, I believe, as I recall, a 10% royalty. And I went to a local printer in Des Moines and priced how much it would cost to do 1,000 of these. I printed 1,000 of the first EC portfolio. Now, he would never allow the EC artwork to leave New York. So in order to do this, I had to go to New York, take the art from the vault under his supervision, take it out to a print shop and stay with it and bring it back. So I would go to a print shop in New York, and I would actually take page by page, take it and put it in the camera, which was a big flat plate camera like litho shops use. And I would put the art in, and the guy would shoot it. Then I would take it out and put the next piece in so that nobody touched it but me. I wouldn't go to lunch or anything. I sat right there and guarded it like a bulldog, you know. Nobody was going to get any of that art as long as as I had signed out for it. And I would take it back to Bill's office, from which it would be taken back to the vault. And so that was the way I did the 6 EC portfolios. And of course, to my great delight and not really surprise, the first time I took the first EC portfolio to a comic convention was in New York City, and it was just an immediate hit. I charged $10 for it, and at that time, most of the fan-type publications were $3 or $4, maybe $5. So I reasoned, well, this is bigger, it's unique, it's unusual, and I'd only printed 1,000 of them, so I thought, you know, they'll eventually go out of print and become collector's items. And I was selling them as fast as I could. You know, people would come up to the table and open it and look at it and say, I've got to have this, and plop down their $10 and take their EC portfolio. So within the first hour of having exposed them to the collecting public, I knew that I was going to make a profit on this little project of printing these portfolios. So when that one was successful, immediately successful, I mean, there was never any question that it was going to be successful after it was exposed to the public. Right after that, I thought, well, this is great. What'll I do next? So then I thought, well, I wonder if I could get away with just reprinting everything, from the top to bottom, you know, every story, every text story, everything, and doing it in some kind of a permanent format. And that was sort of when the idea for doing the EC library was born. And I started doing that, and it became successful, and that was when I decided I could quit teaching and just do this full time. Well, Bill had kept the art for 2 reasons: out of sentiment and love for it, and realizing that, like when Woody Gelman's project came along, he had the art there to pull out of his vault and have it reshot in whatever size or whatever format he wanted to, so that he could do reprint projects. And for that reason, he wouldn't let any of the art go. So after I had finished the EC portfolios and started to do the EC library, both Bill and I realized that since I had now photographed all this art with good clean line negatives, that the existence of those negatives was basically just as good as the existence of the artwork. And the next argument was that, is this art, where is it better for this art to be? In a vault in New York City, wrapped up in brown paper packages away from the light of day, or framed and hanging on someone's wall in their den or in their rec room? And so it was in an effort to please collectors who wanted to own a piece of EC by owning some EC art, and the fact that he didn't need it for reproduction anymore, and the fact that Bill was getting older, and he knew that eventually, after he passed away possibly, the art would get sold, it would get distributed, and he wanted to be around to see how it was done and to participate in that. So in about, I think, 1978, we sort of developed the policy that after I had photographed an entire title, like Weird Science or Vault of Horror or whatever, and I had the negatives, we had the reproduction situation in control there, that now we could sell the art. And so we started this series of auctions. And the response to them at the time was very good, but today those same pages and covers go for many times what they did 15 years ago. And of course, to Bill's credit, even though he owned this art himself, and he had paid the storage bill over the last 30 or 40 years to keep it in the condition it was in, when the money started coming in from the sales of the art, he gave the artists a large share of it. Well, Bill had taken 12 of each EC comic as it was published, and he was always very archive conscious, and he took 12 comics and wrapped them up in brown paper and sealed them and salted them away for whatever reason in the future. And I knew of this, and other EC fans knew of this, and of course, as we were building our collections and looking for certain issues of EC Comics, we always thought how great it would be, you know, for Bill to open up some of these packages and for us to get some of those mint condition EC Comics that he'd put away at the time of printing. And Bill and I, over our dinner conversations, had often talked about what should be done with these, because he knew, just like with the artwork, he knew that if he passed away and these comics were still in his possession, that his heirs would not really know what to do with them. None of them were really into comics as collectibles, and he was afraid that someone would come along and take advantage of that and buy them all for much, much less than they were worth. And so wanting, again, this is an aspect of his generosity. He wanted to provide for his children as well as he could, so he wanted to get as much as he could get for the file copies because all the money went to his children. And he also wanted the EC collectors who had been faithful to EC for all these years, he wanted them to be able to have some of these. So when we first talked about it, we said, well, what we'll do someday is go to a major comic convention like the New York convention and take a table and take these file copies out and sell them, you know, and they'll bring a premium price, and Bill will get the pleasure of sitting there seeing the looks on people's faces when they get to buy these great mint condition copies of the comics. And as time went on, that seemed to be less and less practical, because what about the guys in California who didn't go to the New York convention? They were going to miss out on this. And also the thought of hauling them into a hotel and handling them and having people pick them up and look at them, deciding whether or not to buy them, was almost defeated the purpose, because the allure of these comics were that they'd basically never been touched by human hands since they were first put away in the 50s. So by the time he decided to do that, auctions were sort of gaining momentum as a way to approach collectors for things like this. And we thought about auctioning them, and then we thought about just offering them for sale at a certain multiple of the comic book price guide prices. And so eventually we did the latter. What we did was we went through all the file copies. We wore white editing gloves, film editing gloves, like film editors use to avoid getting smudges on the film, so that none of the oils from our hands or anything would transfer to the comics. And we took all these packages apart and put the comics in Mylar sleeves and sorted them and numbered them, and turned out that we didn't have 12 complete sets, that Bill had broken into some of these packages over the years to give, like he gave me a Shock Illustrated 3. He'd done that with other people, and so some of the packages had 12 in them, some of them had 9 or 10. A few of them had much less, and there was one situation, Vault of Horror number 12, which was the first issue of Vault of Horror. There was only one file copy in the package. He had given them away, or someone in the office had taken them without him knowing it, or something like that. But anyway, we found out that instead of having 12 complete sets, we in reality only had one complete set. And the others were almost complete. I mean, out of 300 comics in a set, maybe we would have 295 or 296 or something like that. So we decided, he decided basically, he wanted each of his children to have a set of these, and he wanted his wife, Annie, to have a set. So 4 sets were set aside, and the other 8 were, we talked about how to sell them. Well, we decided to keep the ones which were in complete sets of those 8 to make rather expensive archival boxes to put them in. I had these made at a library supply company. They were made from all acid-free materials and so on, with the idea being that you could put your file copies in one of these boxes in the Mylar sleeves. The boxes were large enough to accommodate the comics when it was in a Mylar sleeve, and that they should last indefinitely. And when we finished doing this, we'd put a set of shock suspense together and a set of two-fisted tails together and so on. When we finished doing this, we had a bunch of comics left over which made incomplete sets. So we decided, as our first approach to selling these, we would sell these individually and then use that as a guide to how to price the complete sets. So when I first sent out my first, of course by this time, I had a mailing list developed of 7,000 or 8,000 guys all over the country, mostly in the United States, but some in Europe and Canada and so on, who were EC addicts. And these were the guys who were the target audience for all my publications and for the EC artwork and for the EC file copies. And so I made up a list, and like a stab in the dark, I priced these file copies at somewhere between 2 and 3 times the price guide price. We looked in Bob Overstreet's price guide, and if Crypt of Terror number 17 was listed in there as $300, we would say, well, let's see if we can get $800 or $900. And thinking, of course, that, you know, we can always come down if they don't sell. And when I sent out that first list, I sold half of those comics in just the first few weeks. I mean, orders just flooded in for those. So I was happy to know that we hadn't overpriced them and that the pricing was probably just about right, because it wasn't too long after that until all the single individual copies had sold. Now, of course, there were guys out there who knew that the method we were using, and so they didn't buy some of the individual copies waiting for the sets to come up. And then we had the archival boxes made and put the sets in the boxes and priced them similarly, and they sold very quickly. And today, they're selling for several times what they sold then.
I was in the 8th grade, and I met this person that was the same age as myself, and his name was Landon Chesney. And Chesney was a very unique person, he's very talented as an artist. And the subject of comic books came up, and he told me that he collected EC comics, and I'd never heard of EC comics. So he invited me over to his house one day and pulled the small box of comic books out that had a small stack of ECs in there and showed me these comic books, and and I was very impressed with the quality of the art and with the subject matter. And he described, or explained to me that these comic books were drawn by various artists, and these artists were really good at what they did, and they were all unique, and each one had a different unique style. And there were certain artists that seemed to do the covers, and there were artists that did the lead story, and there were other artists that did the backup stories. And so I became an instant EC fan. After buying I stayed with EC until the end, and I collected the ECs. But little did I know that years later, that at that time, I was also collecting coins in the 50s, and at that time, comic book collecting was really an unknown hobby to the general public, and I looked forward to the day that that collecting comic books would become a respectable hobby like coins. And And I didn't know if it would ever happen, but I was hoping that it would happen someday, that comic books would be respected and that would become a legitimate hobby. And so with the ECs getting me into that market and teaching me how the market worked, I got involved with all the fanzines and the adzines and where to buy ECs, and corresponded with the collectors and found out who the dealers were. This was in the 50s and all through the 60s. And I kept talking up this idea of we needed a price guide for our hobby. And the more I talked to people, the more they convinced me that I should be the one to do it. And so I did. I knew at the time when we saw, when Chesney and I saw EC changing and the way they were doing their stories, and they were leaning more heavily to the blood and gore, that was like a death knell to EC. We knew it couldn't last and that it would eventually come to an end. And I kept buying the ECs as a loyal fan all the way to the end, even though I did object to some of the changes I saw occurring with EC. But the quality was upheld, and they kept bringing in, they brought in new artists, and they kept the quality up with the new artists that worked on the ECs. And I guess the science fiction was good all the way to the end. But the horror, I think, is what killed EC, and it almost killed the whole comic industry, because they were the leaders, actually, and everybody followed EC's lead in coming into horror comics in the first place. They put out the first true horror comics, and then the whole industry followed, and everybody was abusing the privilege, and it put comic books in the limelight, and then they became under attack with the Senate hearings and with Dr. Wortham's book. I think for quality, they're right there on top. There's other comic books that were high quality, like the Carl Barks, Donald Duck stories were extremely well written, were very humorous and entertaining, along with the art, and his work was top-notch, and it's some of the best stuff ever done in comics. And the Little Lulu stories by John Stanley is just like Carl Barks. In fact, John Stanley told me that he was a Barks fan, and that he enjoyed what Barks was doing with Donald Duck. And I wondered what it would be like if Stanley, by the fate of history, inherited the Donald Duck stories instead of Carl Barks, how he would have handled that, because he was very humorous too. And he wrote, and I guess those two artists were unique because they wrote their own stories and they did their own pencils, and I guess, well, Barks actually penciled and inked his stories, and he did his own lettering, and Stanley did the pencils and someone else did the inks. But EC, along with Barks and Stanley, were some of the finest comic books ever done. And I think all those influenced a lot of people. Well, Russ called me and told me what was going to happen, and I knew, just being an EC fan, that any true EC fan would have given anything to have been a witness to the opening of these legendary file copies that Bill Gaines had, and we all knew that he had file copies, but no one had ever seen them. And so I was really excited about being involved in that. And it's a shame that there should have been, the press should have been there. They should have been videoing this thing, which wasn't done. We just took snapshots. But it was such an important event, because EC changed my life so much that I felt that this was so important to have these file copies finally come out of the vault, so to speak. So I felt very lucky and privileged to be involved in that. And we had the greatest time opening up those packages in Gaines' penthouse there in New York. And we did it in August. And, you know, in August, there's sort of a chill in the air, and there's fall is just around the corner. And we were feeling, I was feeling this chill, and it reminded me of the holiday season. And so we were opening the ECs, and we were singing Christmas carols, and while we were doing that, and we had the greatest time. They were doing things that no one else would even attempt, and they were trading on grounds that were sacred, considered sacred by their publishing companies, and they got into race hatred, they got into bigotry, and they would do these stories just showing to show the reader how ridiculous it is to be prejudiced. And to a young kid like myself, reading stories like this, these were mind-bending stories and mind-bending concepts that change a person for life. And I think that's why EC has prevailed so many years, because it has had that dramatic impact on people.
I discovered EC Comics when I was a kid, and they weren't allowed in the house. About the only permissible comic books were things like Pogo, you know, and Donald Duck. But all the kids at school were into it, and you know, this was pre-code. And I would smuggle them in, and you know, the classic thing: get under the covers with a flashlight and read them. And I just loved them. I mean, I've always been into the genre. I mean, I was already going to see horror films, and so I just loved it. And I loved the books. I mean, I thought they were just unrelenting and actually sort of moralistic, and you know, bad guys getting their comeuppance, and the illustrators, the illustrations were sensational. I just loved them, you know. Loved those artists. Well, horror movies in that time were pretty tame, and often made on, you know, 70 grand with terrible effects. You know, people laugh at Ed Wood, but, you know, go look at Robot Monster and some of the stuff that was coming out then, all about the bomb and 50-foot people, and pretty corny. There were only a few that I remember in and around that time, maybe even a little later. The Thing, and Day the Earth Stood Still, and War of the Worlds, you know, at least had some oomph. But they could only go so far in terms of graphic violence or bloodletting of any kind. And EC was, you know, people today talk about Resident Evil. Just go look at some of the old EC mags. It was all there. And, you know, a horror fan doesn't shy from that stuff. It's what you're there to celebrate, and it makes you giggle. So EC was able to feed that sort of lust. You know, I think those books almost acted as a library, a reference library, for anyone interested in working in horror, either writing it or making films or drawing new comics. It really laid out a lot of the rules, and it was able to shorthand. It was an anthology, so there were some interest. You know, if you didn't like one story, you could just wait to turn the page for the next one. And I think that what I call its moralistic values really gave you a good sense of you know, evil being punished. And that's thematic. That's a classic thematic theme. I mean, a lot of, you know, even Lovecraft and Poe, and certainly Steve King, says that it should be random. Horror should be random. You don't have to be a bad guy to get punished by some monster. But it gave you an ethic, and I've just sort of tried to stick with that. It also put some little underbelly themes, occasional bits of social satire, political satire, and I thought that was terrific. You know, it opened that door as well, which really horror should do. I mean, horror is meant to be a parable, and a lot of those stories were. And people forget that today. I mean, horror's been reduced, particularly in a lot of recent cinema, to just shock events and no rhyme or reason. The Walking Dead characters that appeared so often in EC, I don't think had a direct influence on my doing Night of the Living Dead. I actually, it was Richard Matheson's book, I Am Legend, that gave me the inspiration for Dead, or I ripped it off, I think. But I don't think that had a direct influence. It certainly had an influence in the way I played the characters, or described and made the characters look, or tried to. In the early days, we didn't have the budget to do a really good EC-style makeup. I didn't know how you get that stringy stuff in the mouth. So, you know, I think there's a link between horror and humor, in that I think there's very similar responses. When you laugh at something, you're not quite sure why you're laughing. It's something that comes up from inside you somewhere. The same with a startle. You're not quite sure. And so you examine sometimes you examine yourself to find out, where did that come from, what am I thinking, and what does it tell me about myself. So I think there's definitely a relation there. It's an unsolicited response, or a knee-jerk kind of a response, which takes you by surprise. And so I think there's that kind of a relation. I also don't happen to think that humor undercuts terror. In fact, I think it can ease the tension. Hitchcock often said that. And I think that people who celebrate the genre want to get those laughs. And EC was famous for that. I mean, all the introductory characters and the outrageous lines that people spoke, and the narratives over the frames were always hilarious. And you know, it was a cross between Mad Magazine and horror. And I really think it works. And, you know, I think finally the studios are getting wise to that in film. I mean, ever since Scream and Scary Movie now, of course, it's all self-referential humor, but a lot of EC's humor was self-referential too. It was more pure. And it didn't slap the genre in the face. It made you appreciate the giggles that are available within the telling of a story like that. My partner at the time and I were visiting Steve King up in Maine, and I suggested, you know, why don't we do an anthology? I mean, he must have a lot of short material, and let's do an anthology. My idea was to explore the whole genre, do maybe 5 stories, 1 in black and white, smaller screen, 1 widescreen color, 1 3D, and not only mix up the stories, but mix up the media. And Steve said, well, if we're going to do an anthology, I think we should do sort of an homage to EC, because we both loved it, and wouldn't it be fun? A week later, he came back and he called up and said, I got the title. It's called Creepshow. That'll be the name of the magazine. I got a couple of stories existing, and I'm going to write a few more. Within, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks, we received the script. Well, we tried to give it a comic book look. And for the comic book itself that appears in the movie, and the panels that appear as drawings, Jack Kamen did those, who was an EC, one of the EC artists. And we did everything we could to say, this is a comic book, it's supposed to be fun. We used the little yellow banners for narration. We actually panned sometimes over to the next panel, although they were moving. And the stories each started with the first page and a move-in on the illustration. And then we used colored lights and gobos and graphics that, you know, like that would wing come out of people's heads. And we just tried to have as much fun as we could and make it really look like a comic book. I suppose in the last 2 zombie films that I did, and in my last film, Bruiser, the one that I just recently finished, there are some graphic influences from EC. Dawn of the Dead, it almost looks like Creepshow, except we didn't do the graphics. I mean, it's very comic book looking. The blood is a little too red. It uses, Tom was able to gradually improve his skills as a makeup artist, Tom Savini. And by the time we did Day of the Dead, the zombies looked terrific. And that really looked much more like the EC drawings used to look than even the stuff that we did in Creepshow. So there's that graphic influence. And in Bruiser, I tried to use a lot of splashy color, too. And although it wasn't, Bruiser is a much more fluid film. The camera's always moving, which I think in a lot of my other early work, I used cuts. And that may be subliminally an influence of comic books. The fact that go from here to here, don't move from here to there, here to there. It might be that influence of seeing things in frames that led me to use that abrupt kind of cutting style. You need a pretty big budget to actually try to imitate those wonderful angles and beautiful lighting that a comic book artist can create. So I've rarely had that kind of budget. I have at times, particularly in the first Night of the Living Dead, tried to do the real hard shadows and the weird angles because we had no budget. When you have no budget, it's like having $200 million bucks. There's nobody breathing over your shoulder. You don't have to pay 50 grand to some insurance company. And people are basically putting in sweat equity, you know, and working 120%. So in the original Night and in Martin, I think, I was able to do a little of that, not as much as I would have liked. But I really tried to do that sort of framing and, you know, that undoubtedly was influenced by EC and also by some of the early horror films that are gorgeous. You know, the original Dracula, just look at that ones with the sound off. It's like watching a bunch of paintings. I loved Ingalls, but I have a spot in my heart for Jack Davis. I mean, that guy just makes me laugh. Even when he's drawing a gross out, he just makes me laugh. I love his shoes. I love the way he draws shoes and knuckles. And there's just something about Jack Davis's stuff that really blows me away. And interestingly enough, my lawyer and oldest friend moved into Jack Davis's house. And we found this wealth of stuff in the attic that he just didn't take with him. So I have a couple of original paintings and stuff like that Barry gave me. We also found letters from Playboy magazine. He used to do the pop things, this year's top 20 football guys, entertainers, all that. The poor guy, I mean, here I think movie makers have a hard time. These letters would, you'd find them complaining about, well, there's too few ice cubes in that guy's highball. Give me a break. I mean, so this guy had to do revisions just like everybody else, and this guy's a genius.
What you're looking at here is the original cover art by Johnny Craig, created for EC Comics in April of 1954 and published on the cover of Crime Suspense Stories number 22. This is one of the most infamous comic covers ever created. This is the cover that Senator Kefauver tried to crucify Gaines with. What he didn't know, and what Bill Gaines didn't share with him that day, is that he and Al Feldstein had in fact already censored this cover. And they did that in a very easy manner. Originally, the cover did show, just as Gaines talks to Senator Kefauver in the hearing testimony, he talks about how to make the cover more gory, the head could have been held a little higher, showing the blood and the gore at the bottom of the neck right here. Well, what Gaines didn't tell Senator Kefauver and the rest of the people on the committee was that he and Feldstein had already censored this cover. And in fact, that's exactly what they did, was they cut this art out of the original sheet of paper it was drawn on and lowered it down a ½ an inch. And then trimmed off the gory part right here at the bottom. They took a ½ an inch off the bottom there. Then up here at the top, they had Johnny Craig add in a new piece of artwork measuring approximately a ½ an inch to fill that blank void. So in effect, they did censor this cover. And this was not revealed during the investigations, which is kind of funny in a way. Bill Gaines in those days had a lawyer who he occasionally would show his covers to, his upcoming comic covers to, and that lawyer's job, part of the time anyway, was to advise Gaines on which covers he felt had gone over the limit or beyond what would be called good taste. And on a few of these covers, they were censored by Bill Gaines and or Al Feldstein right there in the office before they ever went to press. I once asked Johnny Craig about 25 years ago if he would recreate this cover for me as an oil painting in full color. I called him up on the phone and talked to him about it, and he told me he was kind of reluctant to do that, but he told me he would write me a letter. Well, about 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail, and it said, "Roger, I've given it great thought," and he says, "No, I've got to turn you down on it." He says, "I never really liked doing the blood and gore and the hacked up type of covers, which EC from time to time did use on their crime and horror books. John told me he never enjoyed doing that stuff. He did it because it was a job, and he was trying to provide for his family at that time, and the money was good, and he did it. But years later, he wouldn't do it again. He did not want to repeat making this image.